Hello. So better late than never. Everybody's been ill, it's been isolation, it's been hell. So yeah, better late than never. And today I'll just jump right into it and give a warning that this is going to include cannibalism, and a lot of cannibalism, from one man. And this man is called Peter Bryan, and his nickname is Peckish Pete. He gave himself that nickname and he's quite proud of it. Peter, as we're going to call him, is the last of 7 children born to his immigrant parents that we don't know much about. We know they came over from Barbados, but that's sort of all we know. He had 7 older siblings. And that was on the 4th of October 1969. There isn't a huge amount known about Peter and his childhood and whatnot. There isn't too much known. But what we do know is that he attended junior and high school and then went on to work at like a market stall at age 14-15. After that, Peter ironically went on to teach cooking lessons at his local soup kitchen, which is just ironic and hilarious and, I don't know, weird. So other than that, really not much is known about Peter until his next instance with the law. Well, his first proper instance with the law, which was in 1987 when he attempted to throw one of his neighbours out of a 6th floor window. Strangely enough, nothing was done about it. He wasn't arrested. The victim got away, luckily, wasn't thrown off the window, and left Peter with a big gash on his forehead. But that was it. That was the end of the incident. Cool. So his next run-in with the law would be his next big one, which would be in 1993 when he killed shop assistant Nisha Sheath at a local, shop. He immediately admitted his crimes because he did it in front of her younger brother. It was her father's store that they were working in. So she was killed in her father's shop with her younger brother present. He admitted it, obviously, and was arrested. After the incident took place, Peter tried to then jump from a 3rd floor balcony to kill himself, allegedly. It's debatable whether he was trying to kill himself or he was setting himself up for what happened. After he pleaded guilty to manslaughter but with diminished responsibility because he was diagnosed, after being thoroughly assessed by many psychiatrists, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, so it was determined that he wasn't in the right state of mind when he committed the crime. So in 1994 he was sent to Rampton Secure Hospital, where he was sentenced without a limit of time, so it was just sort of when they felt he was better he could leave. Which would only be 7 years later after he murdered a girl. So he murdered someone in cold blood in front of his brother and then went to prison, went to a unit for 7 years and then came out. This is where he then bounced around some low security facilities, different kinds of facilities. Some were prisons, some were state facilities for mental health. So he bounced around different ones for a while until October of 2003, where a psychiatrist of his said that he had a continued improvement in his mental state and should then be able to live in more independent situations. So after bouncing around even more facilities, in 2004 he ended up at Newham Centre for Mental Health, and this is where everything went wrong because he was given a set of keys. This man was allowed to walk around and be in public and come and go as he pleased, as long as he stuck to his curfew and the rules. But there's no telling a man like this to stick to the rules. And like I said, this is where everything went terribly wrong. I do want to just take a minute before I continue the story of what happened to just say that he was obviously not receiving adequate care. He was diagnosed with a severe mental illness, committed a serious crime, and then was very shortly put in a low security facility and then given door keys so he could roam about and do as he pleased. There's obviously something wrong there. But then when it was investigated after the next few events happened, it was investigated how his care was and if it was adequate, and it was determined it was absolutely not adequate. His psychiatrist had only just started and his social worker had no experience with working with a convicted killer. So the people that were assessed to take care of this man were well out of their depth while they were trying to do so. It kind of didn't matter how hard they tried, something was inevitably going to happen, and it did. On this day, he went about his day as normal, did everything, all his routine as he would as usual, in and out of the facility all day until 6 p.m, where he left the facility and didn't come back. Went to visit his friend Bryan Cherry, who's does not know how they knew each other, but they obviously knew each other. It's not entirely known what happened, how the conversation went when he arrived at the door and stuff, because no one can tell this story. We've only got one person that can tell this story at the moment, and we don't trust it. Somewhere between sort of 7:15 and 7:15 p.m, Peter entered Bryan's residence, came in, and there didn't appear to be too much of a struggle in terms of the door. It wasn't like he forced himself in, he was let in. Mr. Bryan Cherry was known as a nice man who was lonely and didn't have many friends. Well, didn't have any friends, the quote said, but we know he did have one friend, and her name is Nicola Newman. because funnily enough, on the same day that he was murdered, she came by at about 7:15 p.m. to check on Mr. Cherry and see how his day was and whatever. She just popped round, which wasn't out of the ordinary at all. She popped round to his house often. She actually had a key. She let herself in. When she let herself in, she said she immediately smelt disinfectant everywhere. And then almost immediately, Peter emerges from the door of the living room and says, "Bryan is dead." Nicola didn't believe him and tried to open the door, and when she opened the door, she saw very clearly that, in fact, Bryan was dead. He was lay dead on the floor in a puddle of his own blood, and his arms were separated from his body. Elsewhere, not here, just not here. So she obviously immediately called the police. We don't entirely know what happened again in this situation in between her calling the police and the police arriving, because Peter did stay. Peckish Pete stayed there, so I don't know if they just like had a really awkward brew and a chat about what happened in that time before the police arrived, but I don't know. But there wasn't an incident or anything. He didn't hurt her. So the police investigated and immediately discovered that obviously Nicola was right. His arms weren't attached to his body, and it turns out neither was one of his legs. It turned out that Peckish Pete was interrupted during the amputation of his other leg, but he was definitely in process of cutting the other leg off at the time. And he'd sort of scalped him and began removing parts of his brain. So obviously, Mr. Cherry was dead, and his body was surrounded by knives and a claw hammer. And I had to Google that, and that doesn't look like a fun time. So as the police continued their investigation, they walked around the house. They moved from the living room into the kitchen, where they discovered some meat on the hob in the kitchen. And unfortunately, this meat was Mr. Cherry's brain, part of Mr. Cherry's brain, just simmering in what they assume is clover butter, because there was a tub of clover open nearby and it was in like a yellow fluid. You know how meat looks when yeah, but it was brain. Near the clover, I'd assume, there was also another plate with more brain matter, but this brain matter had attached to it hair and flesh, and it was assumed that this was either discarded or saved so he could have some more later. Peter told the officer, quote, "I ate his brain with butter. It was really nice." End quote. It was determined that Mr. Cherry's skull had been bashed a minimum of 24 times, and they'd began removing part of his brain and decapitated 3 of his 4 limbs, and would have decapitated the 4th if he had time, which he did confirm. He did acknowledge the fact that he was in process of preparing to eat Mr. Cherry and was gutted that he didn't really have the time. So Peter was sent to the notorious Broadmoor Hospital for the Criminally Insane, again without a time limit, but you'd assume that this time they would take that a lot more seriously and really think about how long that this man was staying here, assess him thoroughly and keep him secluded, you'd think. So when Peter arrived at Broadmoor on the 15th of April 2004, after killing Mr. Cherry, kicked out of another prison where he was described to the officers at Broadmoor as unpredictable, a grave risk to others, and extremely dangerous. So they were fully aware that this man was not well, for one, and for two, was extremely dangerous to other people. They knew this, and they could tell this from his crimes, but they also knew this because they were told this. He was put on seclusion and assessed for a period of time, and then he was released. He was brought out of seclusion on the 19th of April, which is just 4 days after he arrived. So the assessment period took 4 days for them to determine, no, we feel that this man is safe to be allowed to mingle with other people. So he was put in sort of a ward called the Luton ward, where he was able to socialise with other people, and he was under 15-minute checks. So the staff would visually check every single inmate, person every 15 minutes, and they would make sure that they weren't up to no good, and they weren't in any danger. I can't speak today. Good day to film. Not even a week later, so on the 25th, he was released from seclusion on the 19th. On the 25th, he attacks another inmate, which really gives absolutely disastrous injuries. It's catastrophic. This man does die later. I think it's like 41 days later. So he was attacked on the 25th of April by Peckish Pete, and then 41 days later, the man that was attacked died. So this is death number 3 on Peckish Pete's hands. But 2 of the deaths now have been whilst he was under supervision, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But I'll tell you what happened. I'll tell you what happened when he killed his 3rd victim. So on the 25th of April 2004, a nurse called Joanne Fisher walks into the sort of dining room area of this Luton ward and discovers Mr. Richard Loudwell, fatally injured on the floor. He's still alive, but as we know, he's gonna die. So very injured, blood everywhere. Turns out that Peckish Pete was not being watched properly, took the very short opportunity he had, the first opportunity that he had, that was only days after he was released from seclusion, so already they failed him, but the first opportunity he attacks another inmate with the intention to kill and eat them. Joanne Fisher, the nurse, spoke to Peter after the incident, and whilst waiting for backup and security to arrive, she had a chat with him about the incident, and Peter said that he'd been thinking about this for a few days, and ever since he saw Mr. Loudwell, he knew he wanted to eat him. She also did know in another interview with the police that Mr. Loudwell was known to the staff to be the most unpopular patient that they'd ever seen there. Mr. Loudwell was very unpopular due to his crime, which was killing an 82-year-old neighbour of his named Joan Smith. There's no real known motive for the murder, he just killed her brutally. That's not liked in prison. You don't kill old ladies for no reason. Loudwell, who was 59 at the time, was a hugely unpopular patient, so he should have been under some kind of additional watch anyway. And he was left alone with a cannibal murderer. Mr. Richard Loudwell passed away from the injuries that he received from Mr. Peckish Pete. And these injuries were a ligature strangulation around his neck, so he'd been strangled hard, and blunt force trauma to the head. So he was strangled hard enough to leave a mark and nearly kill a man, and then battered in the head with a blunt force object. Peter said that if he was given more time, he would have liked to eat him. He also said, quote, "I get these urges, you see. I've had these urges ever since I saw him. He's the bottom of the food chain. Old and haggard. He looked like he'd had his innings. I was just waiting for my chance to get him. I wanted to kill him and eat him. I didn't have much time. If I did, I'd have tried to cook him and eat him." End quote. So this obviously unstable man was left alone with the most unpopular patient in the ward. Due to the short time between both of those killings, the last two, Mr. Cherry and Mr. Loudwell, he was tried for both at the same time, where he pled guilty to both manslaughters and received a life sentence. He would never be released from Broadmoor Hospital. Judge Giles Forrester, who was the one that sentenced him, said, quote, "You will never be released because you are too dangerous," end quote. Now, the problem here is that both of the latter murders, the first one, could have been dealt with if the initial incident, the first incident that I talked about that didn't result in anyone dying, if the police would have dealt with that incident, the rest of them might not have occurred. But regardless of that, the last two might not have occurred, shouldn't have occurred under the watch of the whole NHS, under the watch of the system, knowing how dangerous this man is and knowing what he's done before. He was left to kill two people, essentially. He was given freedom that he should not have been given. 9 members of staff were on that day to 19 patients, and they were supposed to be completing these 15-minute checks. But regardless of if that was done on time or not, if one was a bit late, if the nurse was a bit at the wrong time, whatever, I do not see how this man was assessed and it was decided that, yeah, he's cool, just put him with the others. Just let him play in the sandbox with the other kids. He might eat them, he might not, we'll see. It's not something you gamble on and take a chance on, especially when it could result and does result in the loss of people's lives. Now, this man that was murdered by Peckish Pete, the last one, Mr. Loudwell, he was obviously a bad guy because he was in Broadmoor as well, but that doesn't mean that he should be eaten by another patient. The jury found that the dining room was not being adequately observed at the time, and his mental state had not been adequately assessed in the time that he went there. I can't believe that the assessment only took 4 days. And he'd already been diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic by this point. So they did have a starting point. It's not like they didn't have much information on this man. They had all the information in the world on Peckish Pete, and they decided to let him mingle with other people. Twice. This decision was made twice. First, when he was given keys and it was like, yeah, come back maybe, come back if you want. And secondly, when he was allowed to mingle with other people after the first murder. So the hospital released a statement and apologised and changed some of the policies, but there really wasn't too much of a pushback on the hospital, and that's something I don't really understand, because obviously Peckish Pete is completely responsible for the third murder, but if he was treated adequately, he received the care that he needed, and he was under the correct supervision, I doubt that would have happened. The family of Mr. Loudwell, I'm sure, doubt would that have happened, because if he was adequately assessed, I'm sure he wouldn't have been allowed social time, or if he was, it would have been closely monitored and continually supervised. I'm not a psychologist, but you know, he eats people. I'm going to end this with a statement from psychiatrist Dr. Martin Locke, who carried out some interviews with Peter afterwards. Here's the statement, quote, "He is the most dangerous man I have ever assessed," end quote. And it would transpire that there was an interesting conversation that was had between Peckish Pete and the psychiatrist at the time. The conversation was where he was told by Peckish Pete, quote, "You look like a brainy chap and you are quite slim. I think I could take you," end quote. imagine this man has eaten people, said he wants to eat more people, doesn't see what he's doing wrong, and he's just like, I like the look of you. So this concludes with Peckish Pete being confined to Broadmoor for the rest of his natural life, and he will be continually assessed and treated according to what he needs, apparently. Allegedly. He said that the first time. So yeah, that was Peckish Pete. Pretty gruesome, but it's quite interesting. I can never understand why people eat people. I can't understand why murders happen, like, most of the time. Sometimes you can somewhat see what they're saying. If you've made it to the end, thank you for watching and listening, and next week I think we're going to talk about a female killer, because we love a female killer. Bye.